The first thing I saw when I came through my ranch gate was my father's windsock lying in the gravel, half buried under fresh tire tracks. The second thing I saw was a motor grader cutting across Copper Ridge Airfield, peeling apart the runway I had spent years maintaining while an excavator sat beside my hangar. Then I saw my Cessna 185, the airplane I had spent 8 years restoring piece by piece, sitting crooked beside the building with one wing badly torn and its landing gear collapsed. I stopped breathing for a second. I pulled my truck onto solid ground, killed the engine, and reached for my phone before I ever opened the door. There were workers near heavy equipment, fresh cuts in my fence, orange survey stakes running along the strip, and a white SUV parked where aircraft normally turned toward the hangar. Whatever had happened here, I wasn't going to give anyone the chance to say I caused the next part. So I started recording. Blythe Carrington walked toward me through the dust like she'd been waiting for an audience, wearing a cream wool coat, charcoal pants, and spotless ankle boots that looked almost strange against 4,000 feet of torn-up Idaho gravel. She held a document folder against her chest and wore the calm little smile she used whenever she wanted a bad decision to sound official. Behind her, her husband Grant stood near the contractor foreman with his arms folded, watching me like this was already settled. Blythe held out the papers. Emergency Access Remediation Order. I looked past her at my airplane, then at the broken runway lights scattered beside the grader marks, then back at the paper she was offering me. Who authorized you to alter this runway? I asked. She tapped the top page with one finger and said, the board did. Summit Crest needs a secondary evacuation corridor, and this aviation hazard has now been remediated for community safety. That was her answer. I didn't argue about whether an HOA board could do that, because arguing would have given her something more useful than she deserved. Instead, I moved my phone slowly across the scene, catching the contractor's company name, the grader number, the cut fence, the damaged drainage culverts, and every orange stake marked proposed evacuation row. Then I brought the camera back to Blythe. And this work was ordered under that resolution. Grant stepped forward before she could answer. Board owns the liability. Keep rolling if you want. I looked at him. I was hoping you'd say that. His expression changed just a little. Not much. Enough. See, I'd spent most of my working life around wildland aviation, where panic can turn one bad problem into 3 worse ones before anybody understands what happened. You don't touch equipment you haven't inspected, you don't guess when records can tell you the truth, and you never make a claim you can't support after the dust settles. That morning, I treated my own ranch the same way. I photographed everything first. Near the western edge of the strip, something dull flashed under loose gravel where the grader had torn through the shoulder. I walked over, put on my work gloves, and found an old aluminum boundary plate that had been ripped out of the ground. Most people would have seen a dirty piece of metal. I saw 5 words that changed the whole morning. United States Property, Aviation Corridor. I photographed the plate exactly where it lay, with the disturbed ground visible around it, then saved the image with location data before I picked it up. Blythe was still explaining how her board had secured the route and removed a private nuisance, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I was remembering a file cabinet in my father's old office and a sentence he'd repeated whenever land maps came out on the kitchen table. Never assume a fence tells you who owns what's underneath it. I looked at Blythe and held up the plate. You should stop every machine on this strip until your attorney reads the land patent. She glanced at the metal and gave me the kind of patient smile people use when they think they're talking to someone who doesn't understand the grown-up paperwork. The board has already acted, Wade. I kept the camera pointed at her. All right, then that's your decision on camera. That smile disappeared. I stepped away from the equipment and made the first call, then the second. And then I uploaded every video and photograph before anyone could ask me to hand over my phone. I wasn't being passive. I was making sure that when somebody finally asked what happened at Copper Ridge, the answer wouldn't depend on who could talk the loudest. 2 days earlier, that runway had been fully usable. Before leaving the ranch to drive an older neighbor to an aviation medical clinic, I had done my normal caretaker walk and taken maintenance photos with timestamps, including the lights, windsock, drainage, surface, and my Cessna parked safely by the hangar. That gave me something Blythe didn't know I had. Before pictures, after pictures, and a clock between them. Let me back up, because nobody woke up one morning and built a highway across my ranch while I somehow failed to notice. What happened at Copper Ridge was faster, quieter, and much more deliberate than that. The HOA contractor had entered during the 2 days I was gone, using paperwork that looked official enough to get a crew through a cut fence, and they weren't building a finished road. They were destroying the aviation features first, apparently believing that once the runway stopped functioning as a runway, turning it into an evacuation route would become easier. That distinction mattered. So did every receipt, every email, every photograph, and every signature. I notified my aircraft insurer, but told them I wanted the wreckage left where it was until the site could be documented. I sent written notice demanding that Summit Crest and its contractor preserve work orders, messages, photographs, equipment logs, and authorization records, and I called a land use attorney before I moved so much as a broken runway light. Then my first call came back. A woman I had never met asked for my name, the airfield identifier, and the location of the marker I'd photographed. Her voice stayed calm until she asked one question. "Mr. Merrick, is Federal Marker 7C still in the ground?" I looked at the fresh hole beside my boot. "No." The line went quiet for several seconds. Then she said, "Don't let anyone touch that site." That's when I knew the crushed airplane might not be the biggest problem Blythe Carrington had created that morning. And if you've ever had somebody wave an official-looking notice at you and wondered whether the paper actually gave them the power they claimed, keep one field note from Copper Ridge with you. Save the document, photograph the boundary, and find out who truly has jurisdiction before anger makes the decision for you. My name is Wade Merrick, and Copper Ridge had been part of my life long before anybody at Summit Crest started calling it a hazard. I was 56, a former wildland aviation mechanic, and I owned 118 acres of Idaho ranch land wrapped around that narrow gravel strip, along with the hangar and the airplane I had spent 8 years restoring. To somebody driving past on the county road, the place probably looked simple: pasture, pine, a low metal hangar, and nearly 4,000 feet of gravel pointing toward the mountains. It was not simple. My father, Hollis Merrick, taught me that before I was tall enough to see over the instrument panel of his airplane. He flew smoke jumper missions and helped move people, supplies, and equipment when wildfire or bad weather made the backcountry hard to reach. And Copper Ridge was one of those quiet places that became important only when something went wrong. Most days, nothing went wrong. That was the point. When I was a kid, Dad would take me down the runway after spring thaw with a shovel, a measuring tape, and a thermos of coffee that smelled strong enough to wake the cattle. We checked drainage, filled soft spots, cleared loose branches, and made sure the markers could still be seen from the air, because he believed maintenance was mostly about fixing small problems before they became large ones. He never made it sound heroic. He made it sound responsible. Years later, I built my own career around the same idea, working on aircraft used around wildfires where shortcuts had a way of becoming very expensive very quickly. I learned to read maintenance logs carefully, keep parts records, document repairs, and never say something was safe just because somebody wanted it ready by Friday. That habit followed me home when I eventually settled full-time at the ranch. Paper mattered. The Cessna 185 mattered for a different reason, because restoring it was the closest thing Dad and I had to an unfinished conversation. I bought the airframe years after he was gone and rebuilt it slowly, never pretending I had unlimited money or time, keeping invoices and logbooks for every major component while I searched for the right parts instead of the fastest ones. Some summers the first made real progress, and some years I barely touched it. 8 years is a long time. The morning it finally rolled out of the hangar under its own power, I sat on the tailgate of my truck with a cup of coffee and wished Hollis had been there to complain about something I had done wrong. That would have been his way of saying he liked it. Copper Ridge carried those memories, but nostalgia was not what made the runway unusual. The ranch belonged to me, the hangar belonged to me, and the Cessna belonged to me. But Dad had always been strangely precise whenever he talked about the strip itself. He would point toward the runway and say, "We take care of it, Wade." Do not confuse that with owning every legal right attached to it. I understood enough to respect the distinction, even before I understood every document behind it. Boundaries can fool you. Back in 1968, when land in that area changed hands, the federal government had kept certain rights connected to the aviation corridor, and Dad maintained a thick folder of agreements, maps, inspection notes, and old correspondence that followed the runway through the years. As an adult, I became its authorized civilian caretaker, which meant I maintained the facility and could use it within the operating agreement. But I could not simply wake up one morning and turn the strip into whatever I wanted. That limitation had never bothered me. In fact, it protected the place. Copper Ridge still had practical uses beyond my own flying, and over the years its records included wildfire positioning, search and rescue staging, emergency cargo, and medical support when rural distance became the problem nobody could solve with a normal driveway. Weeks could pass without anything unusual landing there. Then one bad day could explain why the runway still existed. For years, the view south of my fence was mostly open country, but eventually survey flags appeared, then utility markings, then grading equipment, and finally construction crews working on a new subdivision called Summit Crest Preserve. There was nothing mysterious about it because projects that size make noise, create traffic, require permits, and announce themselves long before the first family moves in. I watched Phase 1 grow in plain sight. 103 homes went up. At first, Summit Crest was simply the new development down the road, and I had no reason to care whether somebody wanted stone countertops, matching mailboxes, or a clubhouse with a view of the foothills. Their property was their business. Mine was mine. Then a large marketing sign appeared near their entrance promising Phase 2, another 61 homes, and within a few weeks I began seeing vehicles slow down near my south fence, while people inside studied maps and pointed toward Copper Ridge. One afternoon, a dark sport utility vehicle stopped long enough for a man to photograph the runway through the fence. The next morning, I wrote down the plate number in my maintenance notebook. Old habits. 3 days later, a woman named Blythe Carrington called and asked if she could come by to discuss what she called a community safety opportunity. Her voice was polished and friendly, and she already knew the length of my runway, where it met my ranch boundary, and how close its far end came to the county road. That caught my attention. I told her she could come by Thursday at 10, but before I hung up, I asked one question. Is this about aviation? There was a short pause. Not exactly, she said. It is about access. I looked through the office window toward the gravel strip Dad had taught me to maintain, then at the old federal file cabinet sitting against the wall. Suddenly, those photographs at my fence made sense. Somebody wanted my runway. Blythe Carrington arrived at 10 on Thursday in a graphite sport utility vehicle that looked expensive without trying to prove it, and she parked beside the hangar instead of blocking the runway. She was 51, with a neat dark auburn bob touched with gray at the temples, and she wore charcoal trousers, a cream coat, and the kind of quiet gold jewelry that told me she understood how money worked. She introduced herself as president of the Summit Crest Preserve Homeowners Association and mentioned that she had spent years as a development consultant before moving to Idaho. She came prepared. Blythe opened a leather portfolio on the workbench inside my hangar and spread out an aerial map showing Summit Crest to the south, Copper Ridge crossing my ranch, and the county road beyond it. She talked about community resilience, secondary egress, and public safety, but the red line drawn across my runway made the real purpose of the meeting easy to understand. She wanted an easement that would let Summit Crest use the airstrip as an emergency evacuation road. That was the ask. We are not talking about daily traffic, she said. This would be emergency access only, and it could protect a lot of families if we ever have a major wildfire. I told her I understood the safety argument, because I had worked around wildfire aviation long enough to know how quickly a normal summer afternoon could turn into an evacuation. Then I asked for the legal description of the proposed easement, the expected vehicle load, engineering drawings, insurance terms, agency approvals, and written confirmation that the aviation corridor could legally be converted for roadway use. Blythe stopped turning pages. We are still developing some of that, she said, then explained that the county fire marshal wanted a secondary evacuation route before Phase 2 could move forward. Summit Crest already had 103 homes in Phase 1, and the next stage would add 61 more, which meant their single main entrance was becoming a serious planning problem. The proper eastern route existed on paper, but it crossed hard, rocky ground and would require engineering, blasting, drainage work, and a real road project. That meant money. A lot of it. Copper Ridge looked much easier from above because almost 4,000 feet of maintained gravel already pointed in the direction they needed. And Grant Carrington had apparently noticed that before Blythe ever called me. Grant was Blythe's husband and the self-appointed head of Summit Crest's Emergency Access Committee, a title that sounded impressive until you remembered it was still a committee inside a homeowners association. Blythe told me their engineers believed using Copper Ridge could save months of work and a very large amount of construction cost. She called it a practical solution. I called it somebody else's property problem. I cannot sign this, I said, sliding the map back toward her. Blythe leaned forward. What would make you comfortable? I shook my head. This is not a price discussion. I cannot grant you rights I do not own. She stared at me for a second, and I could see her trying to decide whether I was negotiating. She guessed wrong. I explained only what she needed to know. The ranch and hangar were mine, but the runway corridor had separate legal restrictions tied to federal aviation use, so no amount of money from an association could turn my signature into permission I did not have authority to give. Blythe closed the portfolio more slowly than she had opened it. We will have our counsel review that. You should, I said. That should have ended it. Instead, the first complaint arrived 9 days later, alleging excessive aircraft noise near Summit Crest, even though my flight log showed very little activity during the dates listed. Another complaint questioned aviation fuel storage, so I pulled the inspection paperwork and provided it to the proper county contact rather than arguing with Blythe. Then came a complaint about fire risk, followed by one calling the hangar a visual nuisance affecting nearby property values. I made a folder. Every letter went into it, along with the envelope, the date received, my response, and whatever written finding came back from the county. When an inspector visited, I stayed polite, walked the property with him, and asked for his conclusion in writing instead of accepting a friendly verbal answer that might disappear later. Most of the complaints went nowhere. The pattern did not. By then I had also learned why Blythe was pushing so hard, and it was more specific than neighborhood politics. 27 Phase 2 homes were already under contract. The developer was carrying land and financing costs while approvals remained unresolved, and the eastern evacuation route threatened to add millions in engineering and construction while pushing the schedule backward. Blythe had publicly tied her reputation to getting Phase 2 moving, telling residents it would strengthen property values and support the amenities Summit Crest had promised. Access was now tied to money, status, and credibility. That changed things. I did not accuse her of anything, because suspicion is not evidence, and I had spent too many years around aircraft maintenance to confuse the two. I simply kept records and watched what happened next. One Tuesday morning, I drove the runway during my normal inspection and noticed fresh orange stakes placed at regular intervals along the gravel shoulder. Each one carried the same printed words. Proposed evacuation row. I had not authorized a survey, so I photographed every stake before touching anything and followed the tire marks toward the south fence, where fresh tracks showed exactly how the crew had entered. Then I called the survey company whose name was printed on a small tag. The crew chief sounded confused when I told him who I was. We were told access was secured, he said. By who? I asked. Papers shuffled on his end of the line. Grant Carrington, Summit Crest Emergency Access Committee. I looked down the runway at the orange stakes marching across Copper Ridge as if a decision had already been made. Then I opened a new folder. I left every orange stake exactly where the survey crew had placed it, because pulling them out would have felt good for about 10 seconds and helped me exactly 0 after that. I photographed each marker from 2 angles, recorded the time and location, then sent the survey company a written notice stating that I had never granted Summit Crest permission to enter or survey the ranch for an evacuation route. Before lunch, I sent the same notice by certified mail to Blythe, Grant, and the Homeowners Association management address. Now there was a record. 2 days later, a Summit Crest resident forwarded me the newest association newsletter, and right across the first page was a section called Secondary Emergency Route Secured. It said the board had made major progress toward a safer evacuation plan and showed a small map with a red line running straight across Copper Ridge toward the county road. There was no mention of my refusal, no mention of federal restrictions, and no mention that I had just told their survey company to stay off the property. They were selling permission they did not have. I drove to the county planning office the next morning with the newsletter, my photographs, and the original proposal Blythe had shown me in the hangar. A planner named Ellen Park pulled the Summit Crest file and explained that the county had reviewed a concept for secondary access, but review of a concept did not grant anybody an easement or the right to enter land. When I asked whether Copper Ridge had been approved as an evacuation road, she shook her head before I finished the sentence. No, sir. That mattered. I asked for copies of the public file and then called a land use attorney named Corinne Halstead, whose office was about an hour away and whose first question made me glad I had kept my hands off those survey stakes. What have you documented? She asked. I told her about the photographs, certified letters, county file, complaints, inspection findings, flight logs, newsletter, survey company, and the old federal records my father had kept. There was a pause. Then she said, Good. Do not give them a cleaner story than the one they are creating for themselves. I hired her that afternoon. Corinne was not interested in dramatic threats, and she warned me not to block the runway with equipment or get into a shouting match if Summit Crest sent somebody back. If the association wanted to tell residents that I was stopping an emergency route, one angry video of me confronting a worker could become more useful to them than a stack of property records was to me. We would use documents instead. That was the safer move. Corinne ordered certified land records, requested the complete county planning file, asked for the legal description behind Summit Crest's proposed route, and sent a preservation letter covering board communications about Copper Ridge. I went home and started scanning Dad's old runway papers one page at a time, including operating letters, inspection notes, maps, and maintenance records that went back decades. We were not waiting. We were building the file. About a week later, the county fire marshal gave Summit Crest 45 days to resolve the secondary evacuation issue before Phase 2 could move forward through the next stage of review. That did not mean the county ordered them to use my runway, but you would never have known that from the way Blythe presented it to her residents. She began telling people that one outside landowner was blocking a safety route needed for 164 families, mixing the 103 existing homes with the 61 planned homes, as if all of them were already trapped behind my fence. Fear made a useful sales pitch. I started receiving messages from people I had never met, some polite, and some accusing me of caring more about airplanes than families. I did not answer them online, because Corinne had given me a sentence I wrote on a note beside my computer. Do not win Facebook. Win the record. So I saved the posts. Then Corinne found something buried in the county correspondence log that changed the temperature of the whole case. One entry was dated 8 months before Blythe ever walked into my hangar, and beside it were 5 words: Federal Corridor Conflict, applicant notified. The attachment itself was missing from the public packet we had received, so Corinne immediately requested a certified copy instead of guessing what it said. We finally had a breadcrumb from before our first meeting. Before that record arrived, Grant called what he described as an emergency board session at the Summit Crest Clubhouse, and because Copper Ridge was on the agenda, I went with Corinne. The room was full of residents, board members, and printed maps, while Blythe sat at the front with the same calm expression she had worn in my hangar. Grant presented an emergency access resolution declaring Copper Ridge an aviation hazard requiring remediation for public safety. Then the association attorney spoke. He chose his words carefully and said he had not provided a title opinion confirming that Summit Crest possessed legal jurisdiction over the Copper Ridge corridor. The room got quieter. Grant pushed ahead anyway, arguing that the fire marshal's deadline required immediate action and that the board had a duty to protect the community. The resolution passed. That was their choice. I stood only after the vote, handed the board secretary a written objection, and asked her to enter it into the meeting record. Ownership and jurisdiction over that corridor are disputed, I said. You have been formally notified. Please do not send workers onto Copper Ridge until those rights are verified. Blythe looked at me across the table and sighed. The community cannot wait for one man's paperwork. I glanced at the recorder sitting beside the meeting minutes. That is why I brought mine. Corinne touched my elbow, and we left without another word. The next morning she called me before 7. The certified county attachment had arrived. I could hear pages turning on her end. Wade, she said. Blythe was warned about the federal corridor 8 months ago. I sat down at Dad's old desk. In writing, another page turned. In writing, that changed everything. Corinne read the county email to me twice, slowly enough that there was no room for wishful thinking. 8 months before Blythe ever asked me for an easement, a county planner had warned her that the proposed route crossed a federally retained aviation corridor and that Summit Crest would need a federal release before changing its use. Blythe had never mentioned that warning in my hangar, in the newsletter, or during the emergency board meeting. She knew. I wanted to drive straight to Summit Crest and put that email on the clubhouse table, but Corinne told me exactly why that would be a mistake. If we showed Blythe every document we had, we would also show her every hole she needed to explain before the county hearing. Our better move was to preserve the evidence, notify the right agencies, and let the written record develop without giving anyone a chance to rewrite the story around it. So I stayed quiet. Then came the 2-day trip to the aviation medical clinic, and when I returned, Copper Ridge looked like the place I described at the beginning of this story. The fence had been cut for contractor access. The windsock was down, runway lights had been crushed, drainage culverts had been dug open, and long grader marks ran through gravel that had been usable when I left. My Cessna sat damaged beside the hangar after somebody tried to move it during the work. This was no longer paperwork on a table. Corinne arrived before noon, and the first thing she told me was not to clean anything up. We photographed the fence opening, the equipment tracks, each damaged light, the altered drainage, the place where the airplane had contacted the hangar post, and the federal boundary plate I had found near the runway shoulder. I gave her the maintenance photographs from 2 days earlier, so we had a clear before and after record with timestamps. Evidence first. The contractor foreman was still on site, and he looked far less comfortable than Grant had that morning. He told Corinne he had objected when the job moved from grading the runway surface to moving the aircraft because the airplane was not part of what his crew normally handled. Grant, according to him, had said the board was taking responsibility and told them to clear the area so the remediation could continue. Corinne did not argue with him or accuse him of anything. She asked for his name, his supervisor's contact information, and the work order number. Small facts build big cases. That afternoon, we opened Dad's old metal file cabinet and found the document Corinne had been waiting for, a copy of the 1968 land patent covering the transfer history around the ranch. Near the middle was language Dad had underlined years earlier, reserving an 80-foot aviation corridor to the United States. We did not rely on my father's copy alone, so Corinne ordered a certified version and matched it against the county record and the operating agreement I had been maintaining under. The answer was clear. I owned the ranch around Copper Ridge, and I owned my hangar and aircraft, but the runway corridor itself had been retained by the federal government for aviation purposes. My role was caretaker, not owner. That distinction explained why Dad had corrected me whenever I called the whole strip ours as a kid, and it explained why I had told Blythe I could not sell her an easement I had no authority to grant. More important, it meant Summit Crest had not simply crossed a disputed line between two private landowners. Their board had ordered work inside a federal property interest after receiving written notice that federal approval was required. Different problem. Corinne contacted the appropriate federal property office and sent a factual notice with photographs, the marker information, the board resolution, and the work order details, without making claims we could not prove. At the same time, she sent preservation demands covering association emails, board minutes, contractor messages, maps, and communications about Phase 2. I notified my insurer and asked that the Cessna remain in place until its condition could be fully documented. Nobody got to erase the morning. While we waited for the federal response, Corinne explained something simple that I wish more property owners heard before trouble started. A homeowners association rule, an easement, and ownership are 3 different things. A board can vote on matters it actually controls under its governing documents, but a vote does not create a road across land it does not own, and calling something an emergency does not automatically erase another owner's rights. The paperwork has to connect. Ours did. 2 days later, the certified land patent arrived and confirmed the reservation exactly as Dad's copy showed it. Then Corinne obtained the latest operating agreement, which confirmed that I maintained Copper Ridge as an authorized civilian caretaker while the aviation rights remained federal. She laid both documents beside Blythe's emergency access resolution on my kitchen table. One stack showed actual authority. The other showed claimed authority. There was still one question neither document answered. Why would Blythe knowingly take that risk when the county had warned her months earlier? The first clue came from the maps. A certified surveyor named Micah Dorsey compared the official plat with the version Summit Crest had used in its presentations, and the parcel shapes looked nearly identical until he pointed to the legend. The official version identified the federal reservation. The association version did not. Corinne refused to call it fraud without knowing who created the file, which was exactly why I trusted her. We traced records instead. Then the first batch of preserved board communications arrived, and one message from Grant made me read it 3 times. He wrote that if Copper Ridge stopped existing as an operational airstrip, the federal agency would have to decide whether the corridor was worth the cost of rebuilding. Blythe's reply was shorter. She wrote that they needed the route solved before the Phase 2 contract started slipping. There it was. 27 homes under contract, millions more tied up in the Eastern Road option, a 45-day deadline, and a board president who had already told her community that the route was secured. This had never been about airplane noise. It was about making the expensive problem disappear before the money started moving backward. The next morning, a government sport utility vehicle rolled through my gate and stopped beside the damaged runway. A woman stepped out carrying a clipboard, introduced herself as Mallory Keene from the Federal Property Office, and spent several minutes looking at the grader marks without saying much. Then she turned to me. "Mr. Merrick, do not tell me who you think is responsible." She pointed toward the paperwork Corinne had placed on the hood of my truck. "Show me who signed the work order." Mallory did not care about my opinion of Blythe, Grant, or the Homeowners Association, and that was exactly what I wanted from her. She photographed the signed resolution, recorded the contractor work order number, and asked Corinne to send certified copies instead of screenshots or forwarded email chains. Then she walked the full length of Copper Ridge with a measuring wheel and a tablet, marking damaged lights, altered drainage, disturbed boundary points, and the sections where the grader had changed the runway surface. She measured everything. I followed with my maintenance binder and showed her the photographs I had taken before leaving for the medical clinic, each one dated and stored with my regular caretaker records. She compared those images with what was in front of us and asked when the runway had last been usable for an aircraft operation. I gave her the date, the maintenance entry, and the corresponding log instead of trying to make the answer sound dramatic. Records beat memory. Mallory then asked about the Cessna, and I explained that the airplane was mine, not federal property, while the corridor beneath it was the part covered by the reservation. She nodded and separated the aircraft damage from the runway damage in her notes, because different property meant different claims, different insurers, and possibly different responsibility. That small detail told me she was not there to put on a show for anybody. She was building a file. By early afternoon, Micah Dorsey arrived with the certified plat rolled inside a hard tube, and the 4 of us met around the workbench in my hangar. He spread the official survey beside the map Summit Crest had shown residents, then used a pencil to trace the same parcel boundaries across both versions. At first, they looked almost identical, which explained why a homeowner glancing at the association newsletter would never notice anything unusual. Then Micah tapped the lower corner. The certified plat had a legend identifying the Federal Aviation Reservation and showing the 80-foot corridor through Copper Ridge, while the Summit Crest version ended just high enough on the page to leave that information out. The runway was still drawn. The warning was not. Corinne would not let me jump from suspicious to proven, because she wanted to know whether the map had been deliberately altered, accidentally cropped, or simply exported from another source. She requested the original electronic files, the email chain that delivered them, and the board materials showing who had used which version. Until those records came back, we called it what we could prove, an incomplete map presented by the association. Words matter. The next afternoon gave us another piece, and this one came from outside the paperwork. A wildfire had started in a neighboring county, not close enough to threaten Summit Crest, but large enough to move aviation resources around the region. I heard the radio traffic while I was in the hangar and later learned that an aircraft support operation that might normally have considered Copper Ridge had to use another available facility because my runway was listed as unusable. Nobody crashed, nobody was stranded, and I was not going to invent a disaster just to make my point stronger. The disruption was enough. Blythe had spent months describing Copper Ridge as a private hobby strip that served one rancher. So Mallory asked me for the operating history to see whether that claim matched the record. I opened Dad's old cabinet again and started pulling folders. There were records tied to wildfire positioning, search and rescue staging, emergency cargo, and medical support, some recent and some old enough to carry Hollis Merrick's handwriting in the margins. Copper Ridge was quiet most of the time because emergency infrastructure often is. Quiet did not mean useless. Mallory copied the relevant records and asked whether the federal operating agreement had ever been released, abandoned, or formally terminated. Corinne slid the current agreement across the table. Not according to this. Mallory read it carefully. That settled one question. 2 days later, Corinne received the electronic map records, and the file history showed that the Summit Crest presentation had been prepared from a base map that originally contained the federal notation. Somewhere between that source file and the version shown to residents, the lower legend had been cropped out. We still needed to know who made that decision, but the timeline was getting harder for Blythe to explain because she had already received the county warning months earlier. Then the board communication production arrived. Corinne called me to her office instead of discussing it over the telephone, which told me she had found something worth seeing with my own eyes. On her conference table were printed emails arranged by date, with the county warning first, the Phase 2 schedule next, then messages between Grant and Blythe about Copper Ridge. The sequence told the story better than any angry speech could have. Grant had written that if the Strip stopped functioning as an aviation facility, the federal agency would face a practical choice: spend money restoring it or reconsider whether keeping the reservation was worth the trouble. In another message, he called demolition creating the condition we need. Blythe did not tell him to stop. She asked whether the board resolution would protect the contractor. That was different from misunderstanding a map. Corinne leaned back in her chair and said, "Now we know what they thought would happen. Their gamble was simple. Destroy the useful features first, turn the runway into a fact on the ground, then argue that rebuilding an old rural aviation facility made less sense than approving a ready-made evacuation road. They believed the government would choose the cheaper path. They had underestimated what the corridor was for." Mallory requested the complete operational history, while Corinne continued tracing the money and schedule behind Phase 2, so we could show why the timing mattered. 27 buyers were already waiting. Financing costs were continuing. The Eastern Road option remained expensive, and every week of delay made Blythe's promise to residents harder to defend. The pressure explained the decision without excusing it. Then Corinne turned over one final printed email from Grant. "Once the Strip is physically gone, rebuilding becomes their problem," he had written. Directly beneath it was Blythe's reply. "Then make sure the board vote covers the contractor." Corinne pinned the emails to a corkboard in her office in the order they had been sent, and suddenly the whole thing stopped looking like a messy neighborhood fight. The county warning came first, then the Phase 2 schedule, then Grant's messages about removing the runway from service, followed by Blythe asking whether the board vote would cover the contractor. We did not need to guess what pressure they were under because their own records gave us dates, decisions, and reasons. The timeline was tightening. 27 Phase 2 homes were already under contract, and the developer was paying carrying costs while the project sat waiting for a secondary evacuation route. The eastern route was still possible, but engineers would have to deal with hard rock, drainage, grading, and blasting before a proper road could connect to the county system. That route meant more time and millions of dollars that nobody had planned to spend. Copper Ridge looked cheap. Blythe had also spent months telling Summit Crest residents that Phase 2 would strengthen property values and help support the amenities promised to the community, so every delay became a problem for her reputation as well as the developer's schedule. Grant's Emergency Access Committee had made the runway solution sound almost finished before the legal rights were settled, and once the newsletter told residents the route was secured, backing away would mean admitting they had announced something they did not control. Money, credibility, and time were all pushing in the same direction. That explained the risk. It did not excuse it. My first instinct after seeing the emails was to take copies to Blythe and ask her how she planned to explain them, but Corinne stopped me before I got halfway through the thought. "If you show her our whole file today, you also hand her a study guide for the hearing," she said. "Let the documents speak when she cannot change the setting." I hated how much sense that made. So we kept working. Corinne requested the contractor's records through the proper legal process and compared them with the association minutes, while I organized my photographs, caretaker logs, inspection reports, certified letters, and every complaint Blythe had filed against Copper Ridge. Mallory continued her federal property review without promising me some dramatic punishment, which I appreciated because real government work usually looks more like forms, measurements, notices, and long email chains than flashing lights. Micah prepared a certified exhibit showing the official corridor against the associations. Presentation map. Every piece had a job. The contractor records gave us one of the clearest pieces yet, because the foreman's notes showed that the original work centered on removing aviation features and grading the strip for proposed emergency access. When the crew reached my Cessna near the hangar, the foreman had questioned moving an aircraft because his people were not an aircraft handling crew, and that task was not part of the normal site work. A message from Grant told them to clear the area and stated that the board accepted responsibility. That matched what Grant had said on my video. Same story, two sources. Corinne also obtained the board minutes from the emergency session, including the association attorney's warning that he had not provided a title opinion confirming jurisdiction over Copper Ridge. My written objection was attached to those minutes because I had handed it to the secretary before leaving. That meant nobody could honestly say the board had acted without notice that ownership was disputed. They voted anyway. The deeper we went, the less this looked like a sudden mistake made during a wildfire scare. Blythe had received the county warning 8 months earlier. Grant had discussed what might happen if the runway were physically removed, and the board acted only after the Phase 2 deadline became painful. Their theory seemed to be that once Copper Ridge could no longer function as an airfield, the federal government would look at the cost of restoration and decide a road was easier. They were trying to create the answer first. Then came the hearing notice. The county scheduled its Phase 2 review, and Summit Crest would have to show how it planned to satisfy the secondary evacuation requirement. Corinne smiled when she read the agenda because the hearing gave us something an argument at the ranch never could: an official room, an official record, and a specific question Blythe had to answer in public. Did Summit Crest actually control the route it was claiming? That was the whole case. A few days before the hearing, the association submitted its presentation packet, and Corinne called me as soon as she opened it. One slide carried a bold heading saying secondary evacuation access, completed, with Copper Ridge shown as the route to the county road. I stared at the screen and felt my jaw tighten because Blythe was still presenting the corridor as settled even after the demolition, my written objection, the county warning, and the federal property review. "Why are you smiling?" I asked Corinne. Because she put it in writing again. That was when I understood the trap, although we had never needed to set one. Blythe had built it herself. If she abandoned Copper Ridge before the hearing, Summit Crest would have to admit the secondary route was unresolved and Phase 2 would face the expensive eastern option. If she stood behind Copper Ridge, she would have to defend that claim against the certified land patent, the operating agreement, the county warning, the survey, and her own board records. Either way, paperwork had closed the exits. The night before the hearing, I sat alone in Dad's old office and laid out the documents in order, not because Corinne needed my help doing her job, but because I needed to understand every page I might be asked about. I had the photographs from before the demolition, the pictures from the morning I came home, my certified letters, the newsletter, the board resolution, and the caretaker logs showing Copper Ridge had been operational. Dad would have approved of that part. Before I turned off the light, I looked at the old aluminum federal plate sitting in an evidence bag on the desk and thought about how close I had come to marching into Summit Crest weeks earlier and trying to win this with anger. Anger would have given me one loud afternoon. Records had given me a case. The next morning, the county hearing room was already filling when Corinne and I arrived, with Summit Crest residents on one side, Phase 2 buyers near the back, county staff at the front, and Blythe seated beside Grant, with a polished presentation binder open in front of her. Mallory Keene entered a few minutes later carrying one thin federal file. Blythe saw her, then looked at me. She still smiled. The county hearing started with Blythe standing at the front of the room like she was, presenting a project that had already been approved. She spoke calmly about wildfire risk, growing traffic, and the need for a second way out of Summit Crest, then put her final map on the screen with Copper Ridge marked as the completed emergency route. She described the airstrip as an outdated private facility that had been remediated so 164 current and future households could have safer access to the county road. Nobody interrupted her. When Blythe finished, Corinne walked to the same screen carrying one thin folder, and instead of arguing about whether evacuation planning was important, she said everyone in the room agreed that it was. She explained that the question before the county was much narrower. Did Summit Crest possess the legal right to use Copper Ridge as the route shown in its application? Then she placed my written refusal beside the association proposal and showed the date. Permission had never been given. Next came the Summit Crest newsletter claiming the route had been secured, followed by my certified trespass notice and the county planning record showing that no easement had been approved. Corinne moved slowly enough that everyone could follow the sequence without knowing anything about property law. Request, refusal, claim, notice. For steps. Then she displayed the county email sent to Blythe 8 months before our first meeting, and the room became so quiet I could hear somebody near the back close a water bottle. The message warned that the proposed road crossed a federally retained aviation corridor and stated that federal release would be required before the corridor could be converted to another use. Blythe's name was on the recipient line, and the delivery record showed the message had reached the address Summit Crest used for planning matters. She had been warned. Blythe leaned toward the microphone and said the email was only a planning concern, not proof that I owned the runway or had the power to block an emergency route. Corinne did not argue with her. She simply asked Micah Dorsey to come forward with the certified plat. Micah spread the official survey across the county table and explained the boundary lines in plain language, then placed the map Summit Crest had shown residents beside it. The shapes matched, the runway matched, and the surrounding parcels matched, but the association version did not include the lower legend identifying the federal reservation. One map showed the warning. One did not. Corinne was careful not to accuse Blythe of personally editing the map because the file records did not prove who had made the crop, but she did show that the original base material contained the federal notation and that the version used in the association presentation left it out. Then she moved to the board meeting record. The minutes showed that Summit Crest's own attorney had not provided a title opinion confirming association jurisdiction over Copper Ridge before the emergency access resolution passed. My written objection was attached to the same record. They had noticed twice. Grant shifted in his chair when Corinne played the short video from the demolition morning, and his own voice filled the hearing room saying, "Board owns the liability. Keep rolling if you want." Corinne stopped the video there and placed the contractor work order on the screen. The board resolution authorized the remediation, the contractor records tied the work to that authorization, and the foreman's notes showed that Grant had directed the crew to clear the aircraft area when the Cessna became an obstacle. Their authority had become their evidence. Blythe asked to respond and said the association had acted because the fire marshal required a second evacuation route, adding that a technical ownership dispute should not outweigh community safety. A county staff member corrected one point immediately. The fire marshal had required Summit Crest to provide a lawful secondary route for Phase 2, but had never ordered the association to use Copper Ridge. That distinction landed hard. Emergency need did not create an easement. Corinne then placed the certified 1968 land patent on the document stand and read the reservation language identifying the 80-foot aviation corridor retained to the United States. Beside it, she placed the current operating agreement showing my role as authorized civilian caretaker. I owned the ranch around it, my hangar, and my aircraft. I did not own the federal corridor. Blythe heard that last part and leaned back slightly, and for one brief second the tension left her face. Then Mr. Merrick had no ownership right to stop the association from addressing a safety hazard, she said. Corinne looked toward Mallory Keene. That is exactly why I asked the Federal Property Office to clarify the record. Mallory walked to the microphone with the same thin file she had carried into the room and identified herself for the county record. She confirmed the land patent, the current operating agreement, and the federal reservation shown on the certified plat. Then she said it plainly. Copper Ridge Runway does not belong to Mr. Merrick. Blythe smiled. Mallory continued. The 80-foot aviation corridor was retained by the United States. Mr. Merrick maintains it under authorization. Summit Crest Preserve has provided us no federal release, easement, permit, or other authorization allowing the association to convert that corridor into a roadway. Blythe's smile vanished. There it was. Corinne did not celebrate, and neither did I, because the documents had already done everything that needed doing. She returned to the county email, then the board resolution, then Grant's messages discussing the idea that destroying the runway first might force the federal government to reconsider keeping it. One of his emails said that once the strip was physically gone, rebuilding would become the government's problem. Blythe's reply asked him to make sure the board vote covered the contractor. Their own words closed the circle. The county panel took a short recess, and when the members returned, the chair explained that Summit Crest had not demonstrated lawful control of Copper Ridge and therefore could not count the corridor as its secondary evacuation access for Phase 2. The development would have to present another lawful route before moving forward on that basis. Copper Ridge was removed from the plan. Blythe stared at the map she had brought into the room, the same red line that had once looked like the cheapest solution to her problem. It now stopped at a boundary her board vote had never possessed the power to cross. As people began gathering their papers, she looked toward me as if she expected some victory speech. I folded my copy of the certified plat and put it back in the folder. A vote can approve a rule, I said. It cannot manufacture a property line. The hearing settled who controlled Copper Ridge, but it did not repair a single foot of runway, replace one broken light, or put my Cessna back together. Over the next several weeks, Mallory's office documented what had to be restored inside the federal corridor, while the contractor's insurer and the other involved parties worked through responsibility for the damage. Nobody handed me a giant check in a courthouse hallway, and nobody solved it overnight. Real consequences usually arrive as paperwork. The restoration plan covered grading, drainage, markers, and the lighting needed to return Copper Ridge to its rural aviation role, while my aircraft claim stayed separate because the Cessna belonged to me. The insurer inspected the logbooks, photographs, restoration invoices, component records, and the damage from the attempted move near the hangar. After 8 years of work, the answer was the one I had been expecting but still did not want to hear. The airplane was not coming back. I eventually received compensation through the claim process, but money could not replace the years I had spent rebuilding that Cessna or the mornings when I imagined Dad standing beside it. I kept one damaged piece from the wing root after everything was properly released, and later I mounted it inside the new hangar beside one of Hollis's old maintenance photographs. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder. Summit Crest had its own cleanup to handle, and this time the residents were asking questions before anybody voted. At a special association meeting, homeowners reviewed the county warning, the board resolution, the legal expenses, and the decisions that had been made while Blythe kept telling them the evacuation route was secured. Enough owners decided that leadership built on assumptions was leadership they no longer trusted. Blythe was recalled. Grant lost his committee positions, and the new board adopted a rule requiring independent legal review before the association tried to enforce anything or authorize work beyond the land and covenant boundaries it actually controlled. That change mattered more to me than watching anyone get embarrassed. It made the next mistake harder. I also refused to treat the families at Summit Crest like they had personally driven a grader onto Copper Ridge, because most of them had simply believed the information their board gave them. The 27 Phase 2 buyers had not signed the work order, cropped a map, or told a contractor to move my airplane. They were caught in somebody else's gamble. They deserved a fair way out. The developer had to return to the real access problem, and buyers were given choices under the arrangements made for the delayed project rather than being used as a reason to force Copper Ridge into the plan. The eastern route was expensive because Rock does not care about a development schedule, but it was a route the developer could pursue through the proper engineering and approval process. Summit Crest would have to build around the law instead of pretending the law could be moved around Summit Crest. That was the difference. Copper Ridge took time to rebuild, and I was glad nobody tried to turn it into something grander than it had ever been. There was no new terminal, no giant federal facility, and no parade of officials standing around for photographs. It returned as a practical gravel airfield with working drainage, visible markers, proper lighting, and a new windsock moving above the same Idaho ground my father had taught me to inspect as a boy. Simple worked. On the morning Copper Ridge reopened, I arrived before sunrise with coffee and walked the strip from end to end, checking the surface out of habit even though other people had already signed off on the work. The mountains were just beginning to catch the light when a wildfire reconnaissance aircraft taxied onto the gravel and turned into the wind. I stood beside the hangar as it rolled forward, lifted cleanly, and climbed away toward the ridgeline. The runway had a purpose again. A few minutes later, A man from Summit Crest came through the gate and introduced himself as one of the residents who had signed the petition calling me selfish. He looked uncomfortable, but he did not make excuses, and he told me he had believed the board when they said the association already controlled the route. I told him I understood how that could happen. Then he asked what he should have done differently. Next time somebody tells you a vote gives them ownership, I said, ask to see the map. He nodded and looked toward the new sign beside the runway, identifying the Federal Aviation Corridor and limiting it to authorized operations. That was enough. I have thought about that whole mess many times since then, and the part that stays with me is not Blythe's face at the hearing, or even the moment Mallory explained who actually controlled the corridor. It is how ordinary the things that protected me were: dated photographs, certified records, an old land patent, maintenance logs, saved emails, meeting minutes, and one written objection handed to a secretary before I walked out of a room. Nothing magical. I tell this story as a dramatized account because the lesson matters more than pretending every property dispute unfolds exactly this way, and laws can differ depending on where you live and what kind of land is involved. But the habit is real. Know what you own, know what the other side actually has authority to do, preserve evidence before anger changes the scene, and use the lawful process when somebody crosses the line. Paperwork has a funny way of making loud people quiet.